Welcome to Born on the Bayou Sports, a Houston sports show made for Houstonians by Houstonians. Join Tim Costello and Scott Barzilla every week as they break down the latest in Houston Astros, Rockets, and Texans news. Tim's a former minor league broadcaster, and Scott has written 2 books on the Baseball Hall of Fame. Yeah, if Javier could get it figured out, it would make things a lot easier because he was that guy everybody was counting on this year to be a Cy Young candidate, take that big step forward and help anchor this rotation with Fromber.
Since he's come to Houston, you can look at the development of guys like Carlos Correa defensively, Jeremy Pena defensively. I mean, you can know Alex Bregman's, certainly I think a better than average third baseman.
And now you're putting teams in 3rd and 8, 3rd and 7, 3rd and 9. Now here comes Will Anderson. Pin back your ears, let's go. So if you're Bayou born and bred, or just like spending time in the H, sit down, relax, and stay Houston strong. Welcome back into another edition of Born on the Bayou Sports. I say welcome all my friends to the show that hasn't ended yet. Tim Costello, Scott Barzilla, joined this week by another guest as we continue to feel that we are not the experts on some of these local sports as much as we're the Astros. So we're bringing in Brandon Scott this week to come in and talk a little Rockets basketball with us. Brandon, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, man, it's always a good time. I appreciate y'all for having me.
Yeah, we appreciate you.
Brandon, we were talking a little bit about off air about your schedule, but can you fill us, in our listeners, and what are some of the stuff you have going on at the station and maybe away from the station?
Yeah, so it's a real interesting time at the station right now, as you guys know, in this digital space. Like we are still in the process of ushering Sports Radio 610 fully into the digital space the way it should be, right? And so that's one of my main tasks, like behind the scenes that people don't see. I think people are probably well aware now that we're streaming every day. Sports Radio 610 streaming every day on YouTube and on Twitch, and has for a while now. I was the leader of that, and it's an exciting time. And in addition to that, I'm on the air a little bit, right? I'm filling in whenever somebody's not around. I'm kind of the first guy out of the bullpen that comes in and tries to eat up some innings for you. So that's what I've been. That's actually a pretty good way to describe my experience on the air recently. I would say over the past few years, it's being an innings eater for Sports Radio 610. This week, I'm in for John Lopez on In the Loop with Landry Locker and Figgy Fig. So that's been pretty cool. And of course, away from radio in the digital space, in the podcasting space, I'm doing the H-Town Hoops podcast with Adam Spillane, which is, I think, what largely brings me here to the work that I do for sportsradio610.com and H-Town Hoops podcast, and being around and just sort of being embedded in what the Rockets have going on.
Absolutely. You mentioned being embedded. You mentioned being the first guy off the bench. It's not an easy task, right? Because the chemistry has to be there on a lot of these shows, and you have to be able to really be an expert on a lot of different Houston sports areas, right? Sports Radio 610, the flagship of the Houston Texans. You can't come in and host a show on that station without being able to talk some Texans football, right? And then at the same time, I'd like to think you're probably the resident Rockets expert at the station as well. And then, hey, this is also Houston, and this is Astros territory. You're always going to be able to have to talk some Astros baseball. So what's it like trying to juggle all of that, while still doing, as you said, your own podcast, the digital stuff, being a guy who covers the Rockets really, really well? How do you manage all that?
Yeah, so the juggling and the managing part is what the constant challenge is. When you talk about the other part of it, like the first end of what you were saying, though, being an expert, quote unquote expert in all of these different Houston sports, that part is actually the easy part, because I do truly have a heart for Houston sports. So it's nothing for me to be like actually invested in what the Texans have going on. It's nothing for me to be actually invested in what the Rockets have going on. It is nothing for me to be actually invested in what the Astros have going on, or if U of H looks like they might be on a Final Four run. Turns out they weren't, But if that's the case, it's very easy for me to get into the subject matter, and we kind of start from there. The fact that I've got a passion for it, and then we just work everything else out after that, which is the latter part of your question, or I guess the heart of your question is, how do you manage it all? I also, raising three kids, so there is a lot to it. And if I'm honest with you, I am 100% still figuring it out.
And you on as well when we were in our prior podcast, and we kind of asked him the same question. I mean, would you prefer to keep the role that you have, or do you have aspirations to be like a regular host on the air, or where do you see your career going as we move forward?
Man, it's so funny that you would ask me this, because I feel like I was having the discussion maybe like no less than 10 minutes before I got on with you guys. So, this is a fresh thought on my mind. I would say I'm really passionate about what I do now. And if what I do now is what I do for however long, I don't think I would have much complaint about it, right? Like, you want to grow, you want to have like some kind of upward mobility. I feel like that's something that we all aspire to, but I really feel myself fortunate to be in the position that I am now. Man, I worked really hard to get here, and for a really long time to get here, man. This was, I would say, I've been at 6'10" for almost 5 years now. And I would say that pursuit, I don't know if you guys lost me here. Yeah,
No,
there I
Oh,
am.
good.
Yeah, close to 10 years in the making. So, I worked really hard to get here. It meant a lot to me to get here. So I'm still kind of soaking it all in. But the short answer to your question is yes. Would I love a show with my name on it, or would I love to make more money? All of these other things that you feel like is coming to you if you keep working at it. Yeah, I've got those aspirations.
No, it definitely makes a lot of sense, and who wouldn't want those opportunities? But you mentioned, like you said, you're raising three kids as well. How do how much do you enjoy being able to share the sports part of that with them as well, right? Because I think any dad out there with kids, that's the best part about sports, right? Is I took my daughter to an Astros game in the opening series on against the Yankees, right? But being able to watch these games with them, or you go through the emotional roller coaster that is a Rocket season, right? We're like, hey, we're on a win streak, hey, we suck again, like, hey, we're on a win streak, here we go, like, oh, we didn't, like, and getting to explain, like, hey, this is kind of like life, right? Like, sports mimics life, and being able to go through that with them. How have you been able to enjoy that aspect of things?
Man, if I'm 100% honest with you, my kids do not totally get it. All they really understand is that it's kind of a cool job to have. Like, dad gets to go to sports games. Why? Dad's not around on some nights because he's actually at the Astros game, which is pretty cool. I would say even more so than just the sports part. I have two daughters and a son, and my son and I get to experience it. We've gone to some Texans games together. The last sporting event I think we went to together was the Dynamo's opening match, so several weeks back, and he's really into that. So that part of it is fun from a sports, just a straight sports standpoint. But as far as like sharing the experience of like I guess what my job is, and like sharing that with them, the coolest part is going back to this digital space, right? Is the fact that, and we didn't have this growing up per se, but the fact that my daughter, who's in the 8th grade, will tell me when I pop up on her friend's Instagram feed from Sports Radio 610, from something that Sports Radio 610 did, or something, or on their TikTok or something like that, which is like totally different from what my experience could have ever been with my parents. Like, my friends see my dad working on Instagram, like that's just it's kind of a foreign concept, but they think it's cool. I don't necessarily, but I like that, at least they do.
So yeah, as a dad myself, I had my daughter played volleyball for a while, and it's something I coached back in the day, and so it was really um, I had to kind of walk that line between pushing her to keep going and then letting her choose her own path. So for your kids, are any of them interested in playing sports, or that's just not something they're really into?
Dude, not a lick. Not a lick. My son, like I said, likes soccer. He likes baseball. He likes basketball. Uh, but as far as like really being into sports, it's shocking. It's shocking that none of them have really taken to it. And we've tried, but my daughter, neither one of them is into it. Like not even in the slightest bit. And my son, I would say has taken to sports, but he's not like, craving to be an athlete. He likes, just as much to.
Yeah, just a little technical difficulty here, but we'll keep going here. Yeah, absolutely. Definitely can see that. And we'll just deal with a couple technical moments here as we make a couple quick changes. But tell us a little bit more about leading into this Rocket season, right? Because I think that's really where we kind of want to drive a little bit of the conversation. But we were going into a pivotal year for the Rockets, right? New coach hired, maybe a new culture being set. What was your thought process coming into this year, and where are you at now with, I guess, how things ended up, maybe?
hard. Seems like he how you view the pecking order, but I would say to pay attention to the ascension of Ime Thompson, and obviously the hope that there is more progression within, from within. So, but I think that's a fair point. Is like, how do you get from here to there? How do you avoid just being, going from in like, the 9 seed? How do you go from being this to just basically being like the Chicago Bulls, who are in the Eastern Conference, good enough to make the play in, but nobody for a second thinks that they could go far beyond that.
You mentioned Amen Thompson as the link going forward. Do you see him as the point guard though, right? Because I think there's some opportunities, especially in this draft. I am a Cougar. I say that before I make this statement. I think Jamal Shedd's going to be a fantastic NBA point guard. I think he's the kind of guy who can come in and affect the team immediately. Do you see Amen as a guy who's going to be your point guard, or do you see him as a wing player? Because I really see him as a guy who is not a true point guard, who is maybe a wing slasher. He doesn't really have, in my opinion, a good enough jump shot at this point in time to let him have full control of the offense. And so for me, it's kind of tough to just say, like, okay, this guy can go run it.
Yeah, I think part of it has to do with how they use them, but also your criticism is valid. Like, the guy doesn't have a jump shot, and his handle isn't necessarily as great as you would like for it to be for a point guard. So it's hard for me to sit up here and sell you on straight up pure point guard on somebody who clearly needs to, on the NBA level at the very least, needs to improve their jump shot, their shot overall, and their handle, right? Like you, like a point guard needs to be able to handle the ball and I honestly, shoot the ball credibly. So those are areas where he has to absolutely improve. And of course, if he doesn't, then the answer is no. He's not those things. But what we learned about him, I would say, is that he's a guy that all you really got to do is put him in the game, and he's gonna provide some value for you. And I don't know if that's enough to build around, but it certainly is like an important foundational piece to have, sort of this Swiss Army knife. Almost look at it like, he could be a poor man's version of, or maybe even a rich man's version of, just maybe when I'm thinking poor man's, I'm just thinking less crazy. But he's got some like Draymond Green in him, but far more athleticism. But like tremendous basketball IQ, especially for the age, I think, and the defensive ability. I'll say this about him: I don't know if he's gonna be a point guard for sure, because, like we just mentioned, he's got to improve in those particular areas. But I would be willing to bet. I don't have a ton of money, but I'd be willing to bet every dollar that I have, if you can promise me health, that he's going to be healthy, that he'll be an all NBA defensive player multiple times throughout his career. Like he's already shown me that.
Yeah, he definitely he came on strong there at the end. Definitely, the guy I came away impressed with, particularly in the second half, was Cam Whitmore. But he's a guy that didn't seem to get consistent minutes, but he seemed like every time he was in the game, he was doing something. So, what are you seeing from him, and what's the path forward for him to get more minutes, consistently?
So we did this segment on the H Town Hoops podcast, Adam Spillane and I, where I just straight up asked the question. I was like, man, this guy Cam Whitmore is a bucket. Why don't they run Cam Whitmore plays? If there was one thing that frustrated me about the Cam Whitmore experience, is that it felt like they just ran him out there and he seemed like a bat out of hell a lot of times. But it was fun to watch, and he was wildly effective, right? It worked, actually. I just thought there should have been maybe an even more concerted effort to get that guy the ball. But the thing that we learned from watching him is that once he does have the ball in his hands, he is primarily looking to shoot, looking to score the basketball. So I think Cam Whitmore, I would say this, like from the very beginning, he was the guy I wanted them to draft a fourth overall over Amin Thompson. Now, of course, that would have been stupid because he was available at 20. And obviously, you don't want to draft a guy at fourth that you could get at 20. So, good thing I wasn't in charge. But I'm saying that to say how high I thought his ceiling was. I thought he very credibly could have been considered a top 4 or 5 player in his draft class. And I mean, if you look at some of the numbers, there is enough to support at least that the talent is there. I feel like going into year 2, you're now that you figured out a lot more about Alperen Sengun and Jalen Green, and Amin Thompson was able to show you what he was able to in part do because of the health issues, right? He ended up having to be inserted into the starting lineup. I think this can be a real important year for Cam Whitmore in exactly answering that question, because I think he's good enough to be a starting wing in this league, like a starting 2 guard or a starting 3. Like he scores the basketball good enough to do that, shoots it a lot better than I was expecting him to as a rookie. And if you can kind of get his decision making and he's not a very good passer, if you can get some of those things under control, I think that there's a very high ceiling there. He's still a bench player for now, a role player for now, but I'd like to see him get a whole lot more minutes in his second season and see, how far that can go. But could I see like this uber athletic backcourt / wing trio of one day of Amin Thompson, Jalen Green, and Cam Whitmore, in the next 2 years, and that really being frightening for teams? Absolutely.
No, for sure. And I think that's one thing the Rockets have done. They've collected athletes at an unbelievable level. Now it's hoping that athleticism continues to translate into wins. I think is going to be the big question mark going forward. One of the guys that was, I think, a question mark coming into this season was Jabari Smith. I think his season progression to me might have been the most encouraging out of anyone's on this team. I think he's kind of going to be. I look at him in comparison to like the Heat's Chris Bosh would be his ceiling. He's a guy that if you want him to play center and be an undersized center and bang down low, he'll go that. If you want him to play the power forward and stretch it out, he'll do that. He's willing to take less shots and maybe be a little bit more of a spot up jump shooter on offense. He seems to me like the kind of guy that just flows. He doesn't really need to have a ton of plays called for him. Will still find a way to affect the game. What was your opinion on Jabari's growth this season?
Yeah, the biggest thing, the way I would support your opinion on this is the fact that he was able to go, despite the fact that he's still slightly built, and he came back stronger in year 2 than he was in year 1, just to be clear, but still slightly built. He was able to he was able to hang in there at the 5. Like I know there were times earlier in the season where I thought the rebounding numbers and just the overall physicality could be better. And I felt like it did get better over the course of the year. So I was encouraged by I would like for I still feel like the hallmarks of his game, or what were supposed to be the hallmarks of his game, have still been somewhat underwhelming. Like for the most part, like I still want more from him defensively. I still want, or expected at least, a little bit better of a shot, a little bit more consistent of a jump shot, purer of a jump shot, and it looks great off of his hands. But if I were to say like the what I want to see in year 3 is for him to become just a little bit more consistent of a defender, and he's already pretty doggone good at it. But number 3 overall pick, I am, while pleased with the progression, still find myself just wanting more and feeling like there should be more there. And I think that there is. So I'm actually excited about that. Like feeling like, Jabari Smith is one who, unlike say Jalen Green and Alperen Sengun, who have really shown us what their potential is, I don't feel like we've come close to seeing what Jabari Smith's potential actually is.
Yeah, so if you look at social media and the social media scouts, which I'll put in air quotes, I think the biggest lightning rod on this team is Jalen Green. There's a lot of people that wanted to trade him, right before the deadline, and course, he went on that huge run largely with Sengun out. But if you look at the overall season numbers, they're fairly similar to what you've seen, his first 2 years. Do you see him taking a big step forward just in the consistency, or, are we seeing who Jalen Green is? I mean, at this point?
Yeah. So Jalen, the hope is that what he is actually the best of him, right? The month of February that we, or I should say, the month of March that we saw from him was the big month that he put up. The fact that that's in there, like, you want to hold him accountable for the inconsistency, but also still consider, like, the dude is 21, 22 years old. He's born in 2002. Like, he's that young, and like it might actually just take a few years for him to figure out how to consistently be the best of what he is, what we know he can be. So yeah, man, inconsistent. I can't argue with the results, right? Like, this is what he is right now. A very talented but wildly inconsistent player. And I think year 4 is big on figuring out, like, whether he can be not just a lightning rod, not just like a spark, for a month toward the end of the season, but actually put that together. I thought it was a big deal that he played all 82 games, but also a big deal that he was inconsistent throughout those 82 games. So I I feel like the things that he needs to get better at are obviously the 3-point shooting, and he's not a bad ball handler, but I feel like sometimes he can be somewhat of a careless ball handler. But I was impressed by the fact that he seemed to make a lot better decisions, and for a while he just wasn't hitting his shots, man. That jump shot could not fall. But man, if he works on his shot and can be a more consistent jump shooter, like, we're talking about a superstar. I feel like that's the very simple, sort of short-winded difference between a consistent and inconsistent Jalen Green is the fact that he's an unreliable jump shooter. Some days he's on fire, and some days he can't buy a bucket. He can't buy a jump shot. Or in a 3 specifically, he's actually a pretty good mid-range shooter. But his 3-point shot is, I would say, inconsistent at best, and it's sometimes just flat out bad, or has been throughout these first 3 years. And so, I mean, that's the thing that's got to take the jump. But I mean, you look at it, man. Year 4 is the year. Year 4 to me is the year where you find out, especially on just the second year of him having what. And I don't say this to be disrespectful to Steven Silas, but that was an impossible situation. And this is more of a real coaching situation that is not set up to fail, one that is set up for him to succeed. So I'd much rather see what he looks like in the second year of it before I just write the book or just say definitively this is what a 21-year-old dude is.
Absolutely. And you mentioned, Ime versus Silas. One of the things I think with Jalen too is, I think him specifically skipping that year of college did not allow him to maybe have some of that tough coaching that he needed. Like, could you imagine if Jalen Green had a year with Kelvin Sampson?
He wouldn't have survived. He wouldn't have survived. He would not have survived.
Possibly, but he's a guy who needs some of that tough love, right? Like, Kelvin would have broken him down, then gotten him back up. And maybe it's not Kelvin Sampson, but maybe it's Calipari, or it's one of these other guys that maybe babies the superstars a little bit more. But even if it was like Oklahoma State with Cade Cunningham, right? Like, he understood, like, I'm going to be on a team where everything runs through me, but there's going to be a program, and there's things in place where, they put the one and done rule in for a reason, right? And it was because teams had wasted a lot of top draft picks on guys who maybe weren't mature enough, and they wanted to see these guys scouted a little bit more. Well, then, players started finding the loopholes, right? You could play for the NBA Ignite or the G League Ignite. You could go to Europe. You could do some of these other things. But a guy like Jalen specifically, to me, needs that tough love coaching. He needs a little bit more structure in his life and in his game, right? Like, I think he's just always played AAU style basketball, and you can't do that in the NBA. There's just too many good athletes. You've got to run an offense. You've got to have a system. And I just don't know if he's ever played in a system before Ime, realistically.
Yeah, I think that there's something to that. There is something to be said for perhaps getting tougher coaching in college, but I do think that it's much more like it's far less of an indictment of not going to college for the first year and much more of an indictment of how these guys come up. And when I say these guys, I'm talking about the highly touted, the heralded guys like Jalen Green, like a guy who, in a previous era maybe could have gone straight to the NBA out of high school. Like those top upper echelon guys who are in the NBA by the time they're 19 or 20 or whatever it is, they are coddled in a way in today's game and growing up that's different from previous eras. So I feel like the college coaches that would have listened to you talk about that just now were probably like, yeah, man, I got a bunch of dudes like that have needed this tough coaching, which I guess speaks to your point. But to me is more like a larger point of like, man, these guys kind of come up that way, anointed and in some ways not always challenged. And I don't think that it helped that he was like just automatically, as the number 2 overall pick, just kind of automatically anointed starters minutes, and just kind of there was never really much accountability or hard coaching. It was just like, hey, we're going through these rough years, and this is like it was almost like a dead period, like a wait, like just wasted time, burning daylight. Really, is what they did in that era. Because I don't know if Steven Silas necessarily had the personality to hold them accountable in the way that they needed to, but I'm also not 100% sure that he was empowered to do so either. And so that's the difference. I think there are two major differences between Silas and Udoka. They're both personality and the way that they were empowered. The weight that their word and their say holds with the players, I think, is different.
is whether or not somebody can develop a jump shot, or is that something that kind of you're born with, you have or you don't have? And so, I guess what I'm kind of wondering is, where do you stand on that? Do you think, guys that are either born to shoot, or do you think, is that something that can grow, to the point where you're at least proficient?
This is not a cop out of the question, but let me put it to you this way. Steph Curry was born to shoot. Now, he's obviously put in an incredible amount of work into his body and into shooting, but I feel pretty comfortable saying that dude was born to shoot the basketball. Jason Kidd learned to shoot.
You
So,
talking about Asen? Because he had no J.
hey, exactly. That speaks to the he was acing in the beginning. He's acing in the beginning, but by the end of it, he's winning a championship, a bucket, a knockdown three for the Mavericks in 2011. So, like, by the end of his career, he wasn't acing no more. He had re-added the J back into his name. So I think that I think it's a little bit of clear. Like Jalen Green's not as bad of a shooter, I don't think, as Jason Kidd was in the very beginning. He's not Alan Green, but necessarily, but he's clearly not Steph Curry. He clearly was not born to shoot. How much work you put into it, and I mean, look, there is some luck involved, but at the same time, like there is a to me a work ethic involved here, where to me your jump shot at that age should be getting better every year. I think you can absolutely become a better shooter. And specific to Jalen Green, they've messed around with his shot a little bit with his mechanics. And I go back and forth on this because when he first got in the league, y'all have noticed he shot the ball, and he still sometimes kind of does it. He shoot the ball from his chin like he's in middle school, like your kid. And you're like, man, an NBA player is supposed to have that bad boy up here, like but kind of above the head, or at least to the side, like the shoulders. He's pushing that thing up from his chin, and I'm like, they got to do something with that. And it looks like they tried to. And I'm saying all this to say, I wonder how much working on his shooting mechanics has worked against him. If they should just let him shoot the way he shoots, even if it's not aesthetically pleasing and not ideal because, if you get your shot blocked, they're going to push it right back in your face when you're shooting it at your chin. That was always striking to me that he shot the ball so low for such a high level player. But I think a lot of that has to do with strength, with his body. And, as his body matures, and it has, you would expect you would expect the jump shot to do the same. So I said all of that to say I do think that he can improve his jumper. How much remains to be seen, but it can absolutely be better than what it's been.
I
So,
completely
Mike,
I completely agree with you because I think when you look at a guy like I think LeBron James is a perfect comparison. LeBron spent a lot of his career getting to the rack at will. Like LeBron could score at will, he could get to the rack at will. He didn't necessarily have to become a good to great 3-point shooter until he got to Miami. And LeBron legitimately worked his way into being a 40% 3-point shooter for 3-4 years in the league. You're not going to be Ray Allen, right? Like you're not going to be Steph Curry. You're not going to be, a legendary 3-point shooter, but you can be a guy who shoots 38 to 40% if you spend the entire offseason in the gym shooting threes. But it's going to take, LeBron, I think anybody, whether you love him, you hate him, you think he's a diva, whatever, but I think we can all agree LeBron works his ass off. LeBron is one of the hardest working athletes in America. The LeBron puts the sweat, the blood, the tears, all that stuff into getting better every season. That's what Jalen needs to do, right? Like Jalen needs to have himself a look in the mirror because I think everyone would agree when he was shooting the ball well, he gets to the rim easier. When you have to respect the fact that Jalen's hot tonight from three, now I got to step up. Now I got to guard the line a little bit more. And there are very few players that have an elite first step like Jalen do or Jalen does. He's going to blow right by you if you have to come up to him. So if he can add that element to his game, and again, he's gonna have to pay a blood debt or a sweat debt, right? He owes the NBA gods some sweat, and he needs to start paying up pretty soon.
I think I think this conversation though, and I know we're talking about Jalen Green, but to me, it really applies to the main three guys that I feel like we've talked about up until this point, and who I think are really at this point the highest ceiling guys that the Rockets have on their team. And that's in no specific order: Jalen Green, Alperen Şengün, and Amin Thompson. And here's the rub: I feel like I've spent a lot of time with you guys so far, sounding optimistic and like feeling really good about the Rockets and where they are right now. But here is the rub, and this is specific to Jalen, but really a point about all three of them. They've got three guys who seem like their highest ceiling players, none of which are viable or credible 3-point shooters. When we start having the discussion, and this has come up, I know you guys have seen it a lot. Can Jalen Green and Alperen Şengün play together? And I think it's just as worth asking. Hey, can Amin Thompson and Jalen Green, or Amin Thompson and Alperen Şengün, like asking about the combination of players and whether they can play together? I absolutely believe that these guys can play together. But the hangup is going to be if they don't improve as outside shooters, because you can't have this many guys touch the ball this much and this many of them be unreliable 3-point shooters. Like between Jalen Green and Alperen Şengün, who also himself is not a great 3-point shooter. Like between the three, and we know, of course, Amin Thompson is essentially a zero when it comes to outside shooting. Between the three of them, to not have a credible 3-point shooter, just one of them even, and preferably all of them, but for none of them to be a credible outside shooter, I think is, credible, reliable, consistent, whatever word you want to use, for that not to be the case, I think is a an issue that is going to have to either solve itself by them becoming better, or by them moving a guy, bringing somebody in that, bringing in more shooters, focusing in, keying in on one or two of those guys. I don't think that your three best players ultimately can be three guys who can't shoot.
I know Tim brought up LeBron James. I'm a little bit older than you guys, so the name that comes to my mind is Kobe Bryant when he first came up. because he was obviously drafted out of high school, and those years with the Lakers were brutal. But what we know about Kobe was that he just had this relentless desire to be great, and he was not going to be denied, which is similar to LeBron. And so, I guess in a personality sense, do you see any of those three guys that have that personality quirk that will just force them to be great?
So look, I'm just gonna be straight up about this, like just very clear. I don't see, outside of the fact that he can jump really high, I don't see any similarities in those terms, in terms of like having like this, killer mentality, or killer competitive mentality, or like being sort of like this alpha or anything like that. Jalen Green is very much more to me a jovial, kind of just a much lighter personality. But I don't feel like that means that he can't be just as much of a like his personality does not give off crazed maniacal competitor. It just does not. And I got a hard time believing that it ever will. But I don't think that that necessarily means that he can't be like a super competitive dude, or like somebody that's still like I don't know what Kawhi Leonard's what his personality is, one way or the other, but I know that it's worked for him. And I know these aren't like player comparisons, but I'm saying that to say, like, it doesn't have to look like that. You know, it doesn't necessarily have to be Kobe. But if we're gonna do comparisons and talk about personalities, I do not see that in him. How much that works against him or how much it matters, I'm not sure. But I don't see like Mamba mentality, or Michael Jordan's gonna like alienate all of his teammates. Like I get the sense that everybody like actually likes Jalen Green, and maybe this is good for him, from a personality standpoint. He seems to be very likable and fun loving, and not nearly all that serious like those other guys. Not even close.
So you mentioned, everything you said about Jalen Green, everything you said about the three, future stars of this team. The draft is coming up, quicker than we can even imagine, right? And the Rockets should have a pretty decent pick. They got the pick swap available with the Nets. When you look around this team, there's not like glaring holes, right? You've spent money in certain areas. There's maybe even a little bit of an excess at a position like wing when you've got Dylan Brooks on a big contract, and now Whitmore and Thompson and Jalen Green. I've said it and I'll say it again. I think Jamal Shedd's a perfect fit for this basketball team. I think he could play behind Van Vliet and eventually be the point guard of the future. I'm not going to say, hey, back me up on that, but I will ask, where do you think the team should look in the draft? And if it's not Jalen Shedd, I won't hate you for that. But what are some positions or guys that you think we as fans should maybe start looking at a little bit more?
Yeah, and look, I'm gonna be honest with you about this, and I'm not even ashamed to say this. I am proud to feel like the draft is, and maybe this isn't a good thing to say on a Houston Sports Podcast and me as a Houston sports media, but I am glad to feel like this year the NBA draft is a almost virtual non-event, because for the Rockets specifically, it'll be worth watching, I guess, from a national perspective. But two things about it: the Rockets got enough young guys. They've drafted two guys per round for the last 3 years. So they've drafted enough players. I've seen enough draftees come to Toyota Center. I don't need to see another one. And then on top of that, it's not really that great of a draft. If you hear people talk about this NBA draft, it is thought to be one of the weaker ones that you'll find. Now, people say that, and watch, there's going to be, like two or three Hall of Famers that come out of the draft, and people are going to look stupid for thinking that. But as of right now, there is, for me as somebody that follows the Rockets and covers the Rockets, no buzz, no anticipation on what they might add in the draft. If anything, if you're asking me about draft strategy, I'd much rather see them use that pick to either, you know, to acquire more established talent if they can do so, if that's even out there. I'm reluctant to even say that because I don't necessarily have a perfect draft scenario out there that, or I'm sorry, a trade scenario that works for that. But I'd much prefer to see that pick leave and a more established player come back than even think about who they might draft in the first round at this point. I think that, you've done a pretty good job of, drafting 6 guys in 3 years. I mean, you actually drafted way more than that, but these are the ones that have stuck around. And to me, it's more about, like, you've got enough young clay to mold. It's about putting stuff around it.
Just
So,
seeing what you see with Tank Dell, though, right? Seeing the local hero he's become,
Oh,
it would be great. It would be great if we
the
could get
Jamal
Jamal.
Shedd. Look, the Rockets aside, let me say this about Jamal Shedd, since you have brought it up a couple of times,
I
and
love
I
the
don't
guy.
want
I love that man.
I don't want to sidestep it. I 100%, I completely disagree with any of the mock drafts or any of the commentary that has this guy being undrafted. And maybe he does go undrafted. I'm not saying that he won't. But the idea that he wouldn't be one of the top 60 players that would be available to an NBA team is absurd. There are not 15 guys. I wouldn't say that there are 15 guys in college that I would take over Jamal Shedd in the draft, pound for pound, position, whatever it is. I would absolutely, if I had a needed point guard, and I thought the value was right. I think there is something to feeling like, hey, if I can get Jamal Shedd at the end of the second round, then I'll wait. If nobody's going to draft a guy, then I get it. But he's going to be a player. He is going to be an NBA player. I'm not saying he's going to be a great player, an all-star. Guy might not even be a starter. But we'll look up. It is right now mid-April 2024. By mid-April 2030, 6 years from now, he'll still be in the NBA. Like, he'll still be an NBA player, and hopefully beyond that. Obviously health matters about it. But if this guy stays healthy, he's an NBA player, 100%.
so the Rockets did make I would say, a paper trade at the deadline, since none of the principals were involved with either team. But I mean, we saw Jack Lawndale actually put in some good minutes towards the end of the season. What do you think Steven Adams brings to the team that Lawndale does not?
Oh, well, I mean, I hate to even say this because, like you said, Landale did end up playing really well there towards the end. But, like, Landale's a little bit more of a finesse guy. There is no, I don't think, a more brute force that they could bring in like Steven Adams, with some exceptions, like, a Valanciunas from New Orleans. Like, there are very few guys that are this, like, just flat out, like, strong and mean and nasty. So I think what he's gonna add, or what he'll bring, is just like this. It'll be this added element of what you saw them develop into toward the end of the season or throughout the season. And I'm not just talking about the fights, which were, entertaining, to be like, oh, the Rockets are fighting again, somebody's getting ejected again, more technical fouls, like that becoming like this sideshow part of their identity. I thought it was mostly harmless. But, like, not just that, but honestly, that edge and toughness, like, on the court, like, to where teams actually feel it, not to where it's just like a sideshow and we're talking about technical fouls, but an actual physical presence. You talk about, like, the center position. We talked about Shingun and Jabari Smith, and you mentioned Landale, but, like, the physical presence that Steven Adams can provide them, I think, is unlike anything that they've had, since and he's more physical than Clint, but, like, the Clint Capella, Dwight Howard days. Like, they have not had, to me, a like that type of presence. And for as good as Shingun is, and I think he has made some improvements defensively, he's just not gonna. I don't think he's ever gonna be that. He's never gonna be the tough guy, the brute force that Steven Adams is. And I think there's some value to that. I do wonder how much, like, what are his limitations after, at this age, after the injuries and all of that. And so we will see how that plays out. But, I am excited about the potential of, you know, when Alperen Sengun is out of the game, maybe it becomes more Jalen Green or Amin Thompson or Cam Whitmore centric, but defensively you're upgrading because if there was one issue I had with the Rockets is that at times because Alperen Sengun is just not that defensively, and Jabari Smith, for as hard as he tries, like I mentioned earlier, is still slightly built. They could get beat up by bigger and more physical teams. Like just go up and down in the NBA and find the teams that have bigger, more physical guys, and they would struggle with those guys. And I think that Steven Adams will help them with that in a lot of ways.
Couldn't agree with you more. You got to have somebody willing to throw that forearm shiver sometimes when people come down
Right.
the lane. But let's shift it. We got about 5 minutes left here in the program. I know, Brandon, you got some demands on your time tonight. One of the things Scott and I like to do every week, we like to tip our proverbial cap to something great we saw not only in the sports world but the real world. Brandon, you're the guest. Is there anybody you want to maybe recognize or give a tip of the cap to this week?
Well, I would say that for me, and this is an all-encompassing Houston sports podcast, so I would say, like, since this is a positive sort of vibe, I'm gonna tip my cap to Jose Altuve.
Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna tip my cap to Jose Altuve because it feels like, and he has his moments where he's struggling, but it feels like a time with the Astros where things feel like they're slipping away. Like you're like, man, you can't keep losing games. You can't be like can't lose series and all these other kind of things. That the one constant or the thing that you can count on is Jose Altuve. Dude just signed a new contract. He's the oldest of the core, right? The core guys, and he's still out there performing. So I don't know if that fits along the lines of the theme, but I've been thinking about this over the last few days. It's like, thank God for Jose Altuve being the dude that leads off this lineup. At the very, like, if you're having like anxiety, sports anxiety about where the Astros are right now, at the very least you can start the game whenever the Astros lineup goes up there. You start the game with Jose Altuve up there. It's a calming feeling.
Absolutely. And at the worst case scenario, if this window is closed, like, hey, we still get to watch a Hall of Famer finish up his career. So
That part.
That's a great tip of the cap. Scott, what about you this week?
I'm going to go away from the sports world. And I didn't talk about this much last week, but I had retina surgery actually a little over a week ago. So I'm going to give my tip of the cap to the Man Berkeley Eye Center. I was back at work the next day. I had the pirate thing going there for a bit, but it's been a week later, and I'm going to need to get some new glasses. But I was almost practically blind out of one eye there for a bit, and so I can see again. And it was a great. I was awake through the whole procedure. They gave me a shot near the eye. Never remember it. They gave me a great cocktail. So you think back in like the 1800s, 1900s, that was a bottle of Jack Daniels that somebody's just, giving you before they give you surgery, or maybe a mallet and they just hit you on the head and knock you out. But, we have, some of the best doctors in the world. We could talk about whether or not a care is affordable for some folks, but I can't complain about, the care that I got.
Yeah, absolutely. Glad to see you back and rocking two eyes again, Scott. I'm going to stay out of the sports world as well. I had a chance to participate in the DFW MS walk this weekend on Saturday, 3.5 miles, 5K, as they say. Unbelievable turnout, record-breaking turnout. Was great to see so many people out there, supporting a great cause, fight against MS. I actually threw my back out on Friday and still, would not let myself miss that walk because there were a lot of people with MS, on with canes and scooters on crutches, who found a way to complete that walk. So I wanted to make sure that back pain or not, I did it as well too. So was great to see so many people out there support a great cause and continue to fight for for hope, for a cure, for anything for those people who have MS. Brandon, I know you're tight on time. Do you want to hang out with us for the Scumbags of the Week, or do you have to get moving?
Yeah. I gotta catch this, man. Why
Okay.
not, man?
Well, we got a little new animation now for our Scumbags. As these people have offended us, we're gonna take them on one by one. Brandon, again, you're the guest. Who's your Scumbag of the Week this week?
Yeah, so gosh, I hate to do this. It feels like especially after you guys went non-sports. Both of mine were sports, so I feel like I should have prepared non-sports ones, because this is honestly lighthearted. I don't truly believe them to be scumbags, but can I give you the Astros brass?
Oh, you were thinking on the same line as me, man.
The Astros brass, man. I feel like they've insulted our intelligence a little bit. Like, it's one thing to swing and miss, to use a baseball pun. It's one thing to swing and miss. It's one thing to fail. But I feel like the public comments on why the Astros are where they are, the decisions that they made, they don't measure up. They don't measure up to the standard of accountability, and it's just not good enough, man. I thought they should have been more aggressive in the I don't even know if aggressive is the right word. I just thought they should have used their money in wiser, more precise ways, like really speaking to their needs. Like, it's like other than the actual holes that they have, they would otherwise be a very well built baseball team. They needed a left-handed bat. They needed a back in the rotation depth. They needed, they could have afforded to address center field. They obviously needed to primarily replace the couple of hundreds of innings of relief that they were losing in free agency, and they just signed one guy that pitches one inning a game, and preferably a game that you're winning. So, which is obviously not going to even be all of your games. So, that's got to be it for me. Astros brasses. I don't know the one person specifically to hold accountable because it's hard to know exactly who all's in charge over there. I'm just gonna give a catch-all and say the Astros brass.
That's a good catch-all to have right now, as it's been highly disappointing. I'm going to stay in the baseball world, and I am going to say my Scumbag of the Week this week is the MLB Umpires Association. I think as things like umpire scorecard, and I have the MLB app where you can see where every pitch comes in. You want to talk about another area where they treat the fans like we're idiots and we don't recognize it? Like, we can tell Angel Hernandez sucks. There was an umpire the other day who had a 76% overall consistency on his umpire scorecard. Like, are you freaking kidding me? There's high school umpires who can get the zone right at a 76% rate. We don't ever see any of the repercussions for this at any level. And, at least like in the NFL, and we've talked about before, the NBA, they do the last 2-minute report, right? Like, there's like, hey, we blew this call. Hey, we did this. Major League Baseball never comes out and says, hey, Angel Hernandez sucked last night. But you know what? We all know Angel Hernandez sucked last night because Angel Hernandez has made a career out of sucking. Like, the guy is a national laughingstock for being a bad umpire, but he's still out there calling games. So, you know what? Like, at some point, stop treating us fans like we're idiots and just say, like, hey, we're going to have a better process of weeding out guys who can't get the job done anymore.
Yeah.
I was going to say,
what does he have on them? Not to interrupt. What does Angel Hernandez have on that organization?
Well, he keeps suing because he's not a crew chief. And it's like, you're lucky to have a job, man. But I was going to say they showed JP France the last time he pitched, where he had 3 pitches that were at least 6 inches outside that were all called strikes.
Yeah, it's
and
terrible.
So you'd have to sit there and go like, okay, what are we doing?
All right, Scott, send us home.
All right, Brandon. I hate to have to do this to you. I was coming out of work. I think it was a Monday, and I heard you. I'm not going to call your partner by name, at least not now. But I was listening to him, wondering openly, do we miss Dusty Baker? And And listening to him again today is, there was a movie where this guy, I can't remember what movie it was, but he has this guy running around the street. Oh my God, we're all gonna die. And it's like, settle down. Because my question is, what do we want Joe Espada? You mentioned the holes on the, we have on this roster. What do we want Joe Espada to do? And really, and if you ask me, what would Dusty Baker do with this roster? Well, number one, Victor Caratini would be catching every day because, Yainer Diaz wouldn't be ready for some unknown reason. And Chaz McCormick would be on the bench because he's not a big boy. That's what Dusty Baker would do with this team. And if you look at the history of Dusty Baker as a manager, the teams after he leaves usually go in the tank. And so, you look at the Giants, obviously kind of coincided with Barry Bonds, breaking down and retiring. The Cubs, coincided with Mark Pryor and Kerry Wood not being healthy. And the Reds were just like a flash in the pan. And, the Nationals now, after winning 2019 World Series under, not Dusty Baker, they now suck. So I think, when this talk of Dusty Baker got shoved out, no, he didn't get shoved out. He's probably looking at this roster going like, now's a good time for me to sit on my porch in my rocking chair and drink my wine. That's what he's thinking. And, I can't argue with him. And to me, Dusty's been a common punching bag for Tim and I on this show. He's a good dude. And he's great, I think in the 21 hours of the day that there is not during the ball game. He's great in the clubhouse. He's great with the guys. He's great with the press. But the key is you have to make evidence-based decisions. And, looking at what Espada's done, he's put Abreu down in the 8-hole when he does play. And he's not playing nearly as much, because I don't know. We were debating about what kind of creative ways you could put him on a disabled list with. I was going to say like unexplained excessive chronology was my pick. Or unexplained diminished competence was another possible, explanation. But I guess the short version is that why are we blaming Espada for this? Espada didn't put this roster together.
Yeah. So today on the air, I in unrelated conversations, but you can bring these together. I asked the question today, and I think I asked it in that segment as well. Did Dusty sense a sinking ship? Did Dusty see the writing on the wall and get out early? And also, I said that I was rooting for Joe Espada because I said this today. I feel like he's kind of got an arm tie behind his back because here his first managerial experience, and he's been given a flawed roster, one that has really, really good players on it, like really good on the highest of high ends, but has some very serious and obvious flaws in it. And so, I think that Dusty, to a large degree, dealt with a flawed roster last year. Now, it's not as flawed as what Joe Espada's dealing with now, but I'll just say this about that whole segment. That is, here's some behind the curtain, some full transparency. Everything that was said on that show was believed. Like, I just think the view on Dusty Baker is just kind of polarizing and different depending on what circles you go in. But that was the epitome of trolling the audience. That was the epitome of trying to get the exact reaction that it got out of you and probably everybody who considers themselves to be a Dusty Baker critic, just for no other reason but to troll, like or to be to get conversation going. Now, beyond the troll, what ends up happening is some productive conversation about the game. Like we'll your exact point right there. Like, oh, Jose Abreu is batting lower in the order, and Dusty Baker would have had him up higher. I would respond to you with the fact that Joe Espada was the bench coach last year and has the benefit of the information of last year and how it went with Dusty Baker last year to help inform his decision this year of, hey, let's learn from the mistakes of last year and not do it again. Oh, we've seen this movie before. Oh, this team is even more flawed than the one from last year, and we don't have maybe the same room and margin for error that we may have thought that we did before or in previous years. So I think that's part of it. But those conversations end up happening, I think, on the back end. But that was, I would say, and people, I think, sometimes, like, if you take sports seriously, then you expect the sports takes to always be super serious. And sometimes they are like honest, but peppered with a little bit of sarcasm. Like it wasn't really, hey, do you want Dusty back? More so of, hey, there were bigger problems than Dusty going on. I think would have been the larger point there. But I
I
but
could
I
go.
but I hear you. Like, exactly your reaction is the one that was trying to, that he was, and that was, of course, my co-host idea. That was a segment that was his idea, but I was willing to go along for the ride. I found it mildly entertaining.
I guess, my point in looking at, like, say, Dana Brown, and looking at, the combination of, you know Jeff Bagwell / Reggie Jackson, and made some moves before. My benchmark is, do the moves make sense at the time? Like, if we, shift to the Texans right now, the Stephon Diggs trade makes a ton of sense. I mean, given how much they gave up, and given, what this team needs, it could turn out horribly. We don't know yet, because we haven't, seen them play. We haven't seen how the personalities interact. And I get kind of upset when I hear Monday morning quarterbacking of, well, of course we shouldn't have signed Josh Hader because he sucks. And it's like, well, it's also April 16th. We don't know. But I think it's fair to sit there and say, hey, maybe that 19 million could have gone somewhere else. I mean, that's a fair criticism. But, I don't think anybody at the time thought, well, Josh Hader is going to suck. We know he's going to suck. Nobody thought that at the time.
Yeah, well, but the issue, even with Josh Hader, and like, the issue of him sucking right now is just topical and in the moment, and so you react to it. But I think when you're talking about the move, or this, like, the strategic critique is, yeah, sign, if you can sign Josh Hader, by all means sign Josh Hader, but don't do it at the expense of, obviously it's not my money, and, like, we're talking about rich people paying into luxury taxes, and, like, hey, for my baseball team, for the baseball team that I want to do well, throw all your money away. Sign Josh, sign everybody. Like, literally, sign everybody. Like, let's just, like, I want to win baseball games, and it's just money to you guys. So for me, it's like, sign Josh Hader by all means. But if you're going to be the team that tries to be fiscally responsible, which I think is smart to do, right? Like, that's reasonable. If you're going to try to be fiscally responsible, and say, hey, these are the decisions we've got to make, then, yeah, go fill in the spots that you've lost. Like, to me, I would want to sign multiple relievers, and just hope that a closer emerges among them. Like, we're talking about the 2024, where you might have a closer, you might not. Like, the it might not be the same closer every night. Like, we don't even view that role the same way today as we did, when all of us grew up with baseball. So I'm not saying that you don't, like, you want the best guys on your team, but you also want to fill your holes. And they lost 200 plus innings of relief, and they signed one guy who's great. Don't get me wrong, best closer, arguably top two closer in baseball for the last 6 or 7 years, or however long it's been. But you got 200 innings that you need to replace, and unless you can really sell me on, and you need to be right about it, that your internal options, your Taylor Scott's of the world, whatever, or like whatever it is that you got, that's going to be able to cut it, then okay. Or you know our offseason moves from the previous year aren't going to look as bad, which Jose Abreu thinks still looks just as bad, if not now worse than it did before. So it's like, now you're accumulating receipts of, hey man, y'all didn't really adequately, you either didn't adequately address this need, or you didn't address it at all. In the case of first base, replacing Yuli Gurriel with, just a slightly younger version, but still aging, and honestly, just worse. What has turned out to be a worse player overall, and then just letting this bullpen thing ride like everything was okay, and it clearly isn't.
Okay, so before we let you go, I just want to say Forrest Whitley is making his major league debut as we speak.
I'm seeing that.
Do you have
Yeah.
any plans for the Rapture since it's definitely on its way? Because I didn't think he would beat Armageddon, but I was wrong.
Well, and he just gave up his first run. Are these runs he inherited though? So I don't know if these are actually his runs, but it looks like he just gave up, two runs. Yeah, gave up a double RB, a two RBI double here promptly as soon as you mentioned that. So does that count as the Rapture? I don't know. They're already losing the damn game. So, uh, but yeah, no, I think it's kind of. I said this on the radio today. To me, it's just indicative of this exact point that's being made here of the lack of planning. Like ideally, Forrest Whitley does become a contributor to you at some point, but I think I think we know enough now that a smarter way would have been to plan around having to ever really rely on him. And you look at it now, they're probably going to need him. It's April, and here he is. They're probably going to need this guy.
Yeah, they haven't set themselves up well for bullpen wise, at least until some of these guys on the IL get back. I think McCullers probably ends up moving to the bullpen at some point, and I think you can probably move Hunter Brown to the bullpen as well based on what we've seen from him. But Brendan, I know you got other stuff you got to get to tonight. Really appreciate you joining us. Real quick, I've got the Twitter handle here on the screen at Brandon K. Scott. Where else can everybody find you? I know you mentioned you bounce around on 610, but you mentioned the podcast. Just let everybody know, where can they find you and where can they hear you on a consistent basis?
At Brandon K. Scott on Twitter, at B Scott from Hiram Clark on Instagram, and the podcast or the H Town Hoops podcast, which is centered around the Rockets, and the B Block podcast, which is much more centered around whatever the hell I'm talking about that or thinking about that particular day. It could range from sports to music to the documentaries that I'm watching. It's just more of a kind of a peek into my personality and my brain, which is a lot of sports, but is not as much of regimented or it's just me. There's no like subscriber or listener goal or number. It's almost like a personal blog term podcasting. So check all of those
Peek
out.
inside your head a little bit there.
A little bit. That's the B Block podcast and the H Town Hoops podcast, wherever you get them.
Thank you, Brandon, so much for joining us. We want to wish you the best of luck here and hope you get to hear you on the air more.
I appreciate it, guys. I appreciate that. Always a pleasure, man. Yeah, a ninth inning rally would be great. We'll talk to you guys soon.
All right.